Hi, testing. Hi, everyone. I hope this works. I just got this off Amazon. I want to talk about distribution of software. Who remembers floppy disks? Yeah, they're really cool. We have Quicken here, we have Adobe, all sorts of cool software packaged on 1.44 megabyte floppy disks. I wasn't really around for that era. I remember the games. Here's the original Doom games. I had a Myst set, which was 8 disks, and every time you switched levels, you had to swap in the disks. It's very physical change. There's some really cheeky people who imagine what if we distributed software today with floppy disks. Here's Windows 8. Apparently, it's 1,713 floppy disks. You could do it. You just wouldn't enjoy it. So let's bring it up to the modern era. So we distribute mobile apps. From Xcode, we build IPAs, and then we send it out to iPhones. From Android Studio, we build APKs. We send it out to Android phones. What do you do for the web? So that's what I'm here to talk about. My name is Shwan. I go by Swix, as I was really well introduced. I'm known for my attitude of learning in public, and I'm here to share with you today my journey about learning about the JAMStack. I think it's a really interesting concept, and I want you to come along on this journey with me. I'm also a moderator on the r/React.js subreddit, where there's over 120,000 of us learning about React, posting jobs in React, and helping beginners in React. And I also work on developer experience at Netlify. And at Netlify, we care a lot about this term, JAMStack, and that's why I'm here to talk about today. JAMStack it's a really awkward acronym. It stands for JavaScript, APIs, and Markup. And like a lot of you here, I was also a cynic because I was just one of the people who was just like, isn't this what everyone does-ish? what site doesn't use JavaScript, APIs, and Markup? So it's like, are you trying to, and if you're on Hacker News a lot of people will be like, you're just slapping a marketing term on it and trying to make money. And on one hand, I would say, yeah. And on the other hand, I think it's not that simple, and there's a lot of nuance to this. So here's the modern definition that we're going with. JAMStack is a modern architecture. You create fast and secure sites, but also dynamic apps with JavaScript APIs and pre-rendered markup. And this is important, serve without web servers. So we'll talk about all of these little different elements. And for me, the only way that this makes sense is to put them in context, to take you on a journey of where we came from and why we're here now and why this matters. So Kyle already set up a lot of this for us. We remember the original sites. The original sites were static. The original servers were simply just file servers, essentially. We just requested a file that served it to us. It was pretty simple. And you think we're done, right? Like, we'd just be writing HTML and then serving it out to all these different browsers. But then we wanted more. And that's where we started going off the beaten path a little bit in terms of software delivery. Because then we wanted dynamic sites. So we wanted sites that were generated at request time. So we put a program behind it in whatever programming language we wanted. And then on request, we would generate that page. So we're not serving that static file that was pre-rendered anymore. We're generating all that markup and then sending it out. So that involves running a server. That's not very interesting in and of itself. You want to generate pages from data, you want to store data, and you want to generate from that again. So to do the basic create, read, update, and delete operations. And that's how we get the modern paradigm today. That's what something like a WordPress is run on, having essentially all these elements of a stack. The more popular stack that came out of all of this, there are a lot of different sort of server-side technologies. The more popular one was the open source stack of Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP/Perl/Python, but PHP. And if you notice, this is all server-side only. And you'll see in my story today that we're going to progress a lot from server-side to client-side. And you think about where web technology is going and why. So we take the story. This is kind of a lie. Pretty much as soon as we had anything serious online, we started deviating away from the static site model. And in fact, we started striking that out. And we actually really were writing to run a LAMP stack, which then, when browsers requested from it, it would generate the HTML and serve it to the browser. And we'd just go into this cycle, fancy clicker. We go into this cycle of request, response, request, response. And this was actually a simple enough model, but then we weren't happy and we wanted to have more. But even then, we had some problems with it. So we'll talk a little bit about the problems with the JAMStack. So first of all, the very common one is scaling. We typically have programs and databases and whatever starting to fail over, so we put layers in front of them. They all have different names and different jobs, but essentially you want to put a layer in front of things in order to scale it properly. Eventually, we realized that there are some pages which are not on par with others, and we want to serve them, serve hot paths from something called a CDN. So we also put that in front of our programs as well. And it eventually becomes, and this actually introduces more problems. Here are some of them that we started thinking about and listing. Monitoring, versioning, consistent hashing, auto-scaling, which with Kubernetes these days is a little bit easier, and a whole bunch of different provisioning issues, basically requiring that you have a backend engineer on your team, or that you have that knowledge. And here's a pro tip: if you ever want to raise money from a VC, take all those bullet points and put them slightly askew on the chart, and that represents a pain point. And hopefully you can start to view all the problems that people deal with when deploying their sites in the existing paradigm. So I always like to understand what things are by also thinking about what they're not. So WordPress is decidedly not JAMStack, so is Squarespace. They have a running server, and they generate the page on request time. The problems can really be summarized to just three main ones that we have. Security, just from having so many moving pieces, all of them can be exploited. Reliability from a scalability angle as well as uptime. Complexity and cost, each of these pieces you have to pay for as well as to connect together. So all of these are intractable because they're just built into the architecture in some shape or form. So, and the fundamental insight here is that in order to scale, we have to add static layers, right? We have to add, we scale vertically by adding static layers. We scale horizontally by adding just extra infrastructure in order to improve performance. And we started to ask if there's another way to do this. And so this is the original movement towards static site generations. So the original idea was to decouple the serving, the generation of the site, from the actual serving of the site, and having a very, very strict line here where this is build time and then this is request time on the right. I think this was, and notice I haven't talked about strictly any JavaScript stuff at all. This is all really technology agnostic, but it's all about a discussion of architecture. In fact, some of the most popular static site generators, Jekyll, Hugo, Middleman, they don't use any JavaScript, and they all generate just raw HTML out of templates. There are hundreds more. I can't possibly list all of them. But I want to give you the idea that the JAMStack is a very, very broad and flexible concept. In fact, one of probably the top misconceptions about the JAMStack is that you have to use all of the three things, JavaScript, API, markup. It's more like an OR operation. Chris Coyer recently in his CSS Trick articles focused on this, and he said that actually the core part of the JAMStack is that everything can be statically hosted. He called it the ShamStack, which is pretty cute. Other people call it the MASH stack because it sounded nicer. But the whole point is that everything can be CDN hosted, if my sort of very shaky pointing works over there. Okay, so just to be very clear, we're generating static assets. JAMStack means capable of being served directly from a CDN. Why is that important? That means you can serve your users directly from the nearest point of presence, and you don't have the problems of running existing server infrastructure and scaling that as your number of users grows. So now we come to the mean stack. We've explored the lamp stack a little bit. In the meantime, in the past 20-ish or so years, what happened? JavaScript got serious. We started formalizing it in the ECMAScript specification in 1997. ES2 happened, and then the 10 years we don't talk about. And then by some sheer force of will, even though we miscarried ES4, we came to some beautiful harmony in ES6, and now we have a yearly cadence of coming together and improving the language. So we got serious on the standards side, but we also got serious on the engineering side. We started off with the paradigm of server-side only, the LAMP stack. But now we wanted to put more and more functionality into our front end, so we started actually making libraries to really write JavaScript the way that we wanted to. And this became more and more serious. So now we've slightly changed the model. Instead of just serving HTML, we're also serving modern CSS, modern HTML, modern JavaScript. That's all well and good. But there's also this law of human nature called Atwood's law. Any application that can be written in JavaScript will eventually be written in JavaScript. Now note that this doesn't mean it's a good idea. No one asked you to do it. It just says it will happen because y'all are crazy. and that's a good thing. We want to experiment with the language that we love. And it's easy to not switch languages. It's easy to just go into the source code of whatever you're working with a language that you already understand. So that's what happened. We started writing frameworks out of our individual libraries. Here's Amber, Angular, Knockout, Backbone. And then a curious thing happened. Atwood's law happened, and I got to do this. We looked at the back end, and we said, why you know JavaScript? And so this thing eventually started spawning the movement towards full-stack JavaScript, coined or popularized by Val Karpov in 2013 with the mean stack. Very conveniently, MongoDB, the only commercial company in that stack. But you can start seeing the move in the emphasis from pure server-side to now Angular being a part of it. And the emphasis of bridging that gap between back-end and front-end. So now everything is JavaScript. It's beautiful. I put SQLize in there because there's some people who don't like NoSQL. So does this mean that JavaScript won? Like, is this the full, total victory of JavaScript? I actually call this the Pyrrhic victory of JavaScript. Pyrrhic means that you won, but at what cost? And maybe it's something that you didn't really want to win in the first place. So we'll talk a little bit about why that may not be desirable. But first of all, the very obvious one is that people could start marketing themselves as full-stack developers, knowing everything from Postgres to CSS. If you're that magical 10x developer, God bless you. Most of us actually look more like this, where we know one part of the stack really, really well, and then we just say, I know JS. That means I know JS really super well. It's obviously not that true. And really, I think the fundamental concept is we've gone through and replaced all the LAMP stack with something written in JavaScript. We haven't really fundamentally changed anything in the architecture that we've set up so far. And we've actually added some extra concerns as well. So first of all, JavaScript wasn't meant to be used as a language. It's something that's like a persistent meme in JavaScript that we will use it for things that it's not meant to be used for. So performance. Let's talk about performance. This is an article in 2012, starting to talk about how there's so much load on our pages that people are getting too impatient. Obviously, in 2019, we're much more aware of that today. I really like this article from Alex Russell talking about real-world web performance budgets, and basically just doing the math, right? If you take 5 seconds as like an acceptable speed under 3G, and you do the division, and you carry the 1, and you like divide the 9, you get to a rough budget of 130 to 170 kilobytes of JavaScript. And that's not a lot to work with, especially given modern front-end frameworks. In fact, we actually passed that around about 2012, and then we kept going. And so we just kept shipping more and more JS, and that probably wasn't the victory that we wanted, because that started to impact the user experience. There was one cheat, though, which is client-side routing, because it's fine, a lot of people started reasoning it's fine to have a slow first load, but as long as the subsequent page navigations are fast, because you're not doing a full refresh, that might be an acceptable trade-off. Still kind of a hack. You also know now a lot about the purple pattern. I was going to talk a lot about this, but then I just got front-run by Adam. There's also another element of performance, which is TTI, which is, let's talk about that first initial load. We have hacks for the subsequent loads, but that first initial load is still a problem. We started, because of client-side routing, we were enabled to write single-page apps, and a lot of us actually just went all in on that. Here's the output of Create React App. It's just a div. It's a blank white page, and it's just a div. And you have to load all of the JS first before you populate the DOM with your content. And that's fine for internal apps, but that's not really ideal for stuff that you want your users to see. And that's client-side rendering. This is a chart from an excellent article from Adi Osmani. I'm going to be quoting a lot from this article. And it just shows the waterfall of events that have to happen until your app is actually interactive, which is a fair amount. I don't have to go into detail on that. Basically, it just has that fundamental sequence of like having an initial request, and then getting the HTML, parsing the HTML, and then getting those resources, and then fetching those resources, parsing, compiling, and then rendering, right? So that seems like you're waiting from that first request all the way to the end, like a very long wait for that time to interactive. And so it seems like the best way to do it is to just sort of fundamentally rearrange that architecture and then sort of inline some of the resources that we want. And that's a fundamental model of server-side rendering that we do today, which is having something out of the box that we can just render and have the user interact with and progressively enhance with subsequent resources. I know some people in the room don't like that, but it is an active strategy that people use today. So we got two methods now, client-side rendering, server-side rendering. Server-side rendering, obviously a little bit faster in terms of the total time interactive, but you do a little more work on the server, right? On the actual request, you're actually doing that server-side rendering work on request. And so we haven't really solved anything. We've just got a bunch of hacks, performance-wise, and we haven't really solved anything at the top level with the JAMStack. So that's how I sort of frame that whole transition coming in. If you have only this sort of naive view of client-side rendering, server-side rendering, that's what you're stuck with. But I'm here to tell you that JavaScript is going to win because we have all these other options that are filling in the gap. I'm going to pause a little bit and tell you about the changing environment outside of web development. Sometimes you can feel that web development is the entire world, but there are a lot of trends that are happening around and outside it that affect the way that we build our software and distribute our software. So one that is very uncontroversial is Git-based workflow, CI/CD. It's funny to think that 10 years ago, this was not the norm. We actually still FTP'd stuff. And I don't even want to justify it. Git is Git. We all want source control. We also saw the rise of the API economy. These are all trends that started within the most recent 4 to 5 years that developer-focused companies can rise up and become unicorns in and of themselves, not really touching end users, but serving you, the developers. You could write your own email delivery app, but instead you could just pay SendGrid, who are masters at this, and then you could focus on the thing that sets you apart. Cloudinary, one of our amazing sponsors here, are just the best in the world at handling images. Like, is this something that you really want to write yourself? If it's core to your business, if you're trying to compete with Cloudinary, sure, go ahead. But if you're just trying to be maybe the next Instagram, maybe don't. So then, in fact, like this is so investable and such an interesting area for business that venture capitalists actually started writing landscape charts around this. So third-party APIs, that's the Stripes, Twilios, Cloudinaries, Algolias of the world, are only one part of this entire landscape. And people started exploring different areas. So like some of these became like backend as a service companies. Some of these became communities. If you see a hole in the overall JAMStack landscape, there's a good chance that there's a venture capital-backed business that you can found or a huge popular open source opportunity that you can pursue, because we're still in the very, very early days of this. This is CRV. Redpoint also has another chart, but all just generally giving you the idea that there's an ecosystem coming together in place, and I benefit just from being a part and being a part of that ecosystem. More trends. Serverless, introduced 5 years ago by AWS. then rapidly cloned by Google and Microsoft. I think a lot of people who haven't adopted serverless are underappreciating the scale at which the early adopters have adopted serverless. Just to give you some idea, if my clicker works, Thomson Reuters processes trillions of requests a day. This is 4,000 a second. FINRA, Zillow, all of these like very, very large enterprises. Serverless is production ready. We just need to figure out how to pair it with the rest of our architecture and where it just fits in. What happens when serverless is the norm, is the default? Build tools. Build tools definitely is the norm. This is closer to home. Build tools definitely are the norm. A lot of people actually try to fight for a view source web where I think Kyle last year gave a really good keynote about this, how the JS that is run by machines and the JS that is written by humans are slowly starting to diverge. I highly recommend checking out that video from last year. But we're using build tools to write production quality apps. They just help us. I don't think that's a trend that is going to reverse anytime soon. And lastly, and this is something that Netlify is sort of capitalizing on, is the growth in static site generators. Our founder, Matt Billman, actually ran this tracker called staticgen.com. And we're just tracking all the stats of static site generators and noticing that even though the JAMStack and the JStack and WordPress are taking over the world, the interest in static generators is actually rising faster than that, and that's a very, very curious trend. So basically, and there's something else as well. People are like engineering that with JavaScript, and JavaScript is starting to take over that thing. There are two compelling reasons why JavaScript static site generators make sense more than the older generation of static site generators. It's hard to say generation of generators, but I'm just going to do my best. So first of all, it's made with JS to do templating, but also to do components, especially with the React model is very compelling. Styling as well, you can statically analyze and inline that, but also write CSS and JS, which I know is all controversial topics. But also you can do rehydration, which solves, so static site generators solve that first load problem by generating very performant sites, but then also solve the subsequent load problem by running everything on the client side. Here's a selection of static site generators. I include Next.js, for example, even though basically just because they have a static export mode, but it's an increasingly compelling option. I also have a little bit of a soapbox here, which is some people will get in your face about stack, and they'll do this thing like stack shaming. They'll just say, why are you using JS when you could use a plain old static site generator to generate your apps? Why do you feel the need to ship a JavaScript bundle when you can just ship plain HTML? What I'll say to that is don't let anyone stack shame you. I think you should experiment with these things. We are building not just plain blogs, but also dynamic sites, and we're exploring that spectrum. Like, we want to add functionality. We want to experiment with different types of things. If you can't experiment in your own personal projects, how are we ever going to get progress in our real production commercial projects? I think it takes a community willing to experiment and explore and over-engineer stuff. So go ahead and do that. In fact, the only time you should be making fun of people's stacks is when you're making fun of yourself. Here's Mark Douglas putting Webpack, Babel, TypeScript, React, and Motion together and then writing 3 blog posts. And I want to give a shout out to Sean Larkin. I don't know where he is, but he came up with the perfect response, making fun of himself for Webpack and over-promising things. It's always fun. But anyway, these are all the trends that are happening in the environment around web development, right? Like, that's changed. Fundamentally, all these things did not happen 10 years ago. They've all sort of irrevocably changed. And what if we were to make an architecture that just fundamentally took these as assumptions and made the most out of them? That's how I arrived at JAMStack, right? Just to refresh, we're creating fast, secure sites, dynamic apps, with JavaScript APIs markup served without web servers. How do we do that? We statically render, right? So the one thing that can be possibly faster than doing that little bit of server-side work is to do no work at all and do everything at the build time. Again, I was set up pretty nicely by Adam. I did not know that coming in. But in fact, that's not the only option. There's actually a whole range, and I highly recommend you to check out the article by Eddie Osmani on the various options. I don't have the time here to go through all of them. But basically, you should pick the level of static versus dynamic trade-off if you want to actually explore solutions for your particular use case. Netlify does not own JAMStack. You don't have to be on Netlify to be JAMStack. GitHub Pages was probably the original JAMStack host. Tom Preston Warner created GitHub Pages as well as Jekyll. You can obviously also host on S3, Azure, GCP. Right now is also a really good option, and there are many, many other options as well. These sites are JAMStack, reactjs.org, vue.js.org, Sequoia Capital, even though they're not investors in Netlify, but they have thousands and thousands of pages. Smashing Magazine, one of the top magazines in our industry. But also sort of product businesses, right? Like Citrix.com, Trinet.com, PayPal.me. PayPal is actually not a Netlify customer. They could not adopt Netlify because of their compliance reasons financially, but they built JAMStack infrastructure on their own cloud. These all have interesting talks, particularly the ones by Smashing, the Smashing founder. Recently, Citrix also gave a really good talk, as well as PayPal gave a really good talk at KubeCon London about how they adopted JAMStack in the enterprise. So if you're looking for real production enterprise JAMStack stories, look up these cases. Okay, so, how can I forget to mention the sort of number one dog fooder of JAMStack is Netlify, which every single property, including the Netlify console, is a JAMStack site. These are all static assets, even though everything is dynamically generated. Sorry, I'm clicking the wrong thing. Everything is dynamically generated here, and you can also see login authentication stories here. All of this are static assets. The whole point is that you're delivering your site in a fundamentally different way. There's a small, I don't want to overemphasize this too much, but it's also a very nice element to have in developing JAMStack sites, which is the developer experience. There's a nice symmetry between the build and dev server process locally, as well as when you're deploying your site. You just commit it to Git, and your continuous deployment workflow does the exact same thing, right? It does building, and it deploys it to the CDN. So it's a nice parallel between the two workflows, and it's much easier to think about and reason about. Netlify, I personally have recently been working on Netlify Dev, which does a little bit more around bringing the production environment down to your local testing, so you can test things like redirects and serverless functions locally as well. This is the only Netlify specific slide in the whole thing. Basically, Netlify is built to serve the JAMStack developer. It will live and die by its ability to do that, because that's all it does. Particularly deploy previews, for example, if you make a PR, it deploys a preview of that PR, and you can preview it before merging it in. In fact, that's how we launched our most recent feature, analytics, which are CDN level server-side analytics. We made a PR and then let the CEO go on stage, talk about it, announce it, and then merge the PR, and it was live and deployed on our site immediately. And that's the kind of deploy confidence that I think everyone should try having in their production apps. You can check out the video and the analytics announcement there. So that's the whole journey. That's my whole journey. Recapping my journey from what is this JAMStack thing to, hey, maybe everyone should look at this. This is an interesting model for architecting web. I have, in my title, I've a little bit oversold this. We're not there yet. In fact, we're actually kind of fighting an existential war as web developers. It's obviously super clear that mobile web has overtaken desktop web. And alongside that, apps are overtaking the mobile web as well. Sorry. Mobile internet has overtaken desktop internet. Apps are a huge part. Here in Spain, that's 88% of time spent on your mobile phone is on apps and not browsers. So we're actually kind of far from winning, but I think that it's smart usage of JavaScript in the ways that I've talked about that will help us win versus these other paradigms. We have to match in every way possible, using progressive web app technology, using smarter deployments, every way that we can in building that better open web. Here's more details if you want to learn more about them. There's 3 conferences happening. One just happened in London, New York, and there'll be one in San Francisco to learn more about the JAMStack. There's JAMStack community, where the community gathers and answers questions around that. There's a really active Slack channel from one of the agencies that's active in New York, the New Dynamic. So I like to direct people there. Chris Coyer of CSS Tricks runs this site, Serverless, the Power of Serverless. And that includes a lot of the JAMStack ecosystem companies that you see there. I really like recommending this presentation from PayPal about bringing JAMStack to the enterprise. And lastly, the founding talk by Matthias Billman, the founder of LFI, about the sort of founding thesis of JAMStack at SmashingConf 2016. And lastly, I just want to end off with like a little bit of a sentimental note. There's a question of bit rot in our industry. Like the stuff that we work on probably won't run in the next 5 to 10 years if we don't do it in a JAMStack manner. Like we actually want to have something like a Space Jam site where I can still access it today and it works exactly the same. The only way to do that is to build static assets and to trust the open web, to trust in standards that will be preserved by our community. And with that, I just thank you.